So today for social studies we are getting towards the end, and you'll notice I have put in here a link to an essay that you will write later this week. I want you to have time to begin thinking about it and maybe outlining the essay, but I do not want you to begin writing this essay. I want you to put off the actual writing of your paragraph. It will only be one paragraph. I want you to put off writing that paragraph until Wednesday, but I do want you to begin preparing for that. Today, we are getting to the war moving south, and for this, we have a bit of a PowerPoint. So, I'm going to talk you through this a bit. It should match up quite nicely with your outline that you are supposed to fill in. So do be sure that you are getting these blanks as we go along. So we had taken a little bit of a time out to talk about the war happening out west with Vincennes, the war that was out at sea. The last battle that we had talked about was the Battle of Monmouth, which happened up here in New Jersey. I know this is a pretty complicated map. The main idea of this map is that the war is now moving south. So this is showing a lot of the details, some boats coming from New York to the south, because by the end of the Battle of Monmouth, really the main place where you had British troops was up in New York City. So these soldiers that began to come to the south to fight were coming from the direction of New York City. And they came first into South Carolina, and then they headed into North Carolina. So after the Battle of Monmouth, the British retreated all the way to New York City. After 4 years of war, the British have lost all that they gained. So they won a fair amount of battles, but after they won those battles, they lost the next battle in that spot. And so they are really hemmed in at New York City. Washington and the French, remember the French have become our allies since the Battle of Saratoga back in 1777. So the French are working with George Washington. They're getting ready to invade New York City. Part of the reason why the French took so long to begin helping us fight is because of the reason they got involved in the war in the first place, which was to humiliate the English, to get back at the nation of England, because England had defeated France during the French and Indian War. So France was in this for revenge. It worked just as well for France to get revenge on England by attacking England's other colonies. And they were having a lot of success down in the Caribbean, south of what became the United States. There was not just one, but there were like 3 huge hurricanes down in October in the Caribbean, which finally, just before this event, had persuaded the French that perhaps they'd better make sure that they keep their boats out of the Caribbean. So it began to make more sense for the French to bring their warships and see what they could do against the British up in North America once it got to that dangerous month of October. Thus, they began working with George Washington and the French to get ready to invade New York City. By the way, that little detail comes out of a book that I am just reading. I had not known about these 3 really horrible hurricanes in October of the preceding year, but it makes sense to explain why the French had not been nearly as much help. Since Washington and the French were getting ready to invade New York City, the British decided that they would get some more support if they went south. It's not just because Washington and the French were getting ready to invade New York City, although they did hear about that, but this idea that they had lost all that they had gained in New England and the middle colonies made the British decide to try the other region of the American colonies. once they went to the South, so now our next main idea, a guy named General Cornwallis was put in command. He was fairly successful in invading South Carolina, and then he headed north. As a result, George Washington sent part of his army south to fight Cornwallis. George Washington has had a great amount of success dividing his army at Trenton, when he sent part of his army to Saratoga to fight while he stayed around Philadelphia. And so even though it was a risk again, George Washington sent part of his army to the South to fight. And he sent one of his best generals. In fact, by this time it was his most trusted general, who was named Greene. That was his last name. And so General Washington puts the army under the command of General Greene in the South. So this is Cornwallis. He was the British commander in the South. This is later. At the time when Cornwallis was sent to the South, he was younger and a little less rotund. The British still continued to win a lot of battles in the South. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, the commander named Tarleton, the bad guy in The Patriot, is based on the real-life commander named Tarleton. Now, this is not in your notes, so don't get too lost. But I wanted to bring in the movie The Patriot because if your parents have seen it, they may have talked with you about it. It's not a movie I recommend for 5th graders. It's a little bit too realistic in places. But definitely if your parents have seen it, this part will be familiar to them. So now we get to the fact that in the battles in the South, most of the soldiers on our side were militia. Militia are the untrained soldiers that fight close to home when the enemy threatens their homes. So these are not soldiers that had von Steuben's training at Valley Forge. They had not been through a lot of battles. They didn't know how to fight against the trained British regular soldiers or the hired Hessian soldiers from Germany. And so these militia soldiers, they would show up, but when the battle happened, they very often ran away. Well, if most of your men are running away, you are probably going to lose the battle. So in the South, we were not as successful, so we retreated northward. And then we get to a fellow named Daniel Morgan. He is a really, really interesting person in American history. We've met him a little bit before. He was mentioned in one of the battles in the North. But Daniel Morgan had served in the French and Indian War. At that time, he hit back at a British officer. So that means the British officer had hit Daniel Morgan first. And if you were not an officer in the British Army, a captain or a lieutenant, you were not able to hit back at an officer even if he hit you. So because Daniel Morgan hit back, he was sentenced to 500 lashes. That means he had the whip on his bare back 500 times. He counted as the whip came down on him. He only got 499. And he liked to say forever afterwards that the British owed him that one more lash of the whip. He was a tough guy. He was also shot through the side of the face, and so he always preferred to have his porch painted with one side of his face sort of turned away. You can see this side doesn't quite look as even as the other side. He was also an older fellow, and at the time that these events were happening, he had really bad, what we now think was probably arthritis, to the point where he had to have people help him onto his horse. He couldn't even get up onto his horse alone, and he was in great pain almost constantly. And yet he was commanding part of our army down in the South under General Greene. So with Morgan in charge for us, he had been running from Tarleton, and he decided, though, there was a good place to stand and fight. Daniel Morgan was from this area. He knew the geography. He knew the shape of the land, the lay of the land. He knew where he could pick a spot to have a battle that would make the most of the strengths of the men that he did have. The place he picked was called Cowpens because it was at a spot where people would gather their cows from all around in the mountains, and then they would take the cows down this river all together so that there were enough of people helping, so that the cows weren't all a loss. So he picked this spot called Cowpens for the battle. This is a painting of Banistery Tarleton. Remember, he was on the British side. He was the really mean, unpleasant, really just out to hurt the Patriots commander for the British. He was a cavalry commander, meaning he rode on the horses. I never noticed this in this picture until my fifth graders pointed it out to me one year. And once my fifth graders asked me, when I went to visit the battlefield at Cowpens, they had a huge version of this painting hanging up in the battlefield museum. And I asked the park rangers in charge what my fifth graders asked me, and they had never even noticed this either. So I do not have a good answer for this question. Here is the question. Why does it look like the cannon is getting ready to shoot Tarleton in the butt? If this painting was made by his family, and it was, to show what a great soldier he was, and that was the point of this painting, why on earth does it look like this cannon is getting ready to shoot Tarleton in the butt? All right, so I do not have an answer for that. The park rangers, experts at the battlefield, had no answer for that. Maybe you will look it up and find out. In the meantime, this is Tarleton, what he looked like. So we've seen the two commanders at this little tiny battle of Cowpens. Now remember, Daniel Morgan had decided to stand and fight at this place called Cowpens. Why did he decide that? Well, the first reason that made him pick Cowpens is because there was a river at his back, a river behind him. Now, this is not in your notes, so you might want to jot it off as far as reasons why Daniel Morgan decided to fight at Cowpens. So first of all, the river that was behind him made it so that the militia couldn't run very far. The time of year that this happened and the fact that the militia would be carrying all their weapons and gear made it such that they were not going to try to swim across this river. Also, a lot of them could not swim. Another reason that made the battlefield of Cowpens a strategic place to choose as far as Daniel Morgan was concerned, there was a slight hill and there was an open field in front of it. You'll see in a moment why that was important. Finally, at the back, there was a forest that he could use for cover. Why is that important? Well, Daniel Morgan had a plan. And again, this isn't on your notes. But the first part of Daniel Morgan's plan was he put the militia in front. He put the guys that were going to run away in the front. And he gave them an order. He said, fire 3 shots and then you can retreat. So this is one thing that Daniel Morgan did that was different from anyone else. He told the militia they could run away. He also told them, though, fire 3 times first and then you can run away. So he told them to run away, and he told them where to run away. Then, see if I can get rid of this. Oh no. There we go. he showed them exactly where to retreat so that they would not be in the way of the Continental Army that was next. So he had a plan, and then there was the battle. So this is in your notes. First thing you need to know about this battle is the militia were seen by the British. They were out front. There was an open field. As soon as Tarleton and the rest of the British forces got to the field, they saw the militia. They recognized, they knew these men were militia because they didn't have uniforms on. And so Tarleton ordered his men to attack. When the militia fired their 3 shots, they retreated, and Tarleton followed their retreat and followed them closely. As closely as he could, because he and his men were trying to kill the militia, make them run away, get them out of the way. Because Tarleton was following the retreat so closely and paying attention to that, his men didn't notice the Continental Army that was hidden in the trees on the hill. And so the Continental Army came out and surrounded them. Now I'm trying to turn this part off. There, got it turned off. Because there's going to be an animation here. Just a bit, so I want to make sure it was going to do this right. If I go back, though, we had the militia filing behind the Continental Army as the British are closely following them. Then the Continental Army, with the militia going to support the Continental Army, not running away, they swung around and encircled the British. And so once the British were encircled, they surrendered. And it is because of losses like this that Cornwallis took his troops north to a peninsula along the James River in Virginia for the winter. That peninsula was called Yorktown. But now we have, this is not the right picture. I think this is Lexington and Concord. So we'll just move right along. There. This is the battlefield at Cowpens. This is not my photograph because this shows you very well this slight hill. Obviously, these trees wouldn't have been there as much in the actual battle. It was more of an open field at the time. There is a monument at the battlefield. This is the animation then. So here we have the militia out in front with an open field of fire. Back here is the river. This is the Continental Army. Now we have the British coming. They see the militia. And they are going to attack. Really, truly they are. There they go. So the militia waited until the British were close. They fired their 3 shots and they retreated. And here comes Tarleton and the British regulars, the British cavalry. They come up the hill into the tree line. And they run into the Continental Army, which gives them a nice fight. The militia comes back into the battle, swings around to support the Continentals, and you saw at the very end that the British surrendered. Now, interesting detail, Banistery Tarleton, once he saw what was going on, he knew, especially the militia, the guys from that area, Tarleton knew if he was captured, these guys were not happy with him, and he was not going to stick around to see what would happen if he was captured. So Tarleton ran away from this battle. He left his men get captured. He ran his horse away as fast as he could. And so it's because of battles like this. There was one nearby at a place called King's Mountain where the colonists were also quite successful. And because of battles like this, Cornwallis ended up retreating north and spending the winter at a place called Yorktown, which we'll talk about later. Now, one other little thing about this animation. This is very much simplified from the actual battle. but you can definitely see the strategy that happened of retreating ahead of your enemy to lure them into a trap, and how that made really great use of the militia. This is the information that you need about this battle today. Make sure that you are beginning to prepare for the test that will come at the end of this week. So make sure you look over all of those items that I have mentioned also today in social studies. Thank you.